In a country divided by intolerance, he stood up for equality and peace. Nelson Mandela would rise to become a hero. He is the image of hope, not only for the nation of South Africa, but also for the rest of the world. A lawyer, an activist, a rebel. He had many definitions, but for the people whom he sacrificed everything, he would always be known as Madiba.
Up until then, Madiba was a slogan on a t-shirt, slogan on a poster, and then saw the person, the actual person. I just saw Madiba, so that was Madiba.
For 27 years, Mandela was imprisoned for defending peace and the creation of a multiracial society in South Africa. But his ideal would spread amongst other African nations, and his story would be loved by all.
I mean, here's someone who's like opened the door, created a light for all of us to be able to understand that we can make a difference.
Mandela, a symbol for freedom, a symbol of humanity in the 20th century.
They are trapped in the prison of poverty. It is time to set them free.
But behind a symbol, there's always a man. Behind the man, there's always a story. The Stand for Freedom has seen hardship and struggle, and that struggle has spread across the world. On July 18, 1918, in the South African province of Mvezo, Rolihlahla Mandela was born. He was born into the Madiba clan. His father, Nkosi Mandela, was the principal counselor of the acting king of the Thembu people. Mandela grew up with two sisters tending herds as a cattle boy. Mandela was sent to a Methodist school when he was 7, and a teacher, Miss Mdingana, gave him the Christian name of Nelson. When Nelson was just 9 years of age, his father passed away and Nelson's mother, Nosekeni, took him to the great palace in Mvezo, where he was entrusted to the guardianship of the Thembu regent, Jonjin Taba. When Mandela was 16, it was time for him to partake in the traditional African circumcision ritual to mark his entrance into manhood. The words of Chief Melingili, the main speaker at the ceremony, resonated with Mandela when he explained that young black men would be enslaved in their own country. Mandela would later say that although his speech made no sense to him at the time, it would eventually formulate his resolve for a free South Africa. With the support of his guardian, Mandela started studying native African cultures at the University of Fort Hare, an elite black institution in Alice, Eastern Cape, considered the equivalent of Oxford or Harvard. It was during this period that Mandela became a vocal supporter of the British war effort. He also helped found a first-year student house committee that challenged the dominance of the second years. However, Nelson Mandela ended up being expelled for participating in a students' representative council boycott against the quality of the food. Returning to his hometown with his cousin Justice in December 1940, Mandela found that his guardian Jonjin Taba had arranged marriages for him and Justice. Dismayed, they fled to Johannesburg. It was here where Mandela had his first glimpse of South African capitalism in action. He found a job as a night security officer at the Crown Mines, a job that he wouldn't hold for too long. When the head man of the mines discovered Mandela was a runaway, he had him fired. Staying with a cousin in George Gotch Township, Nelson Mandela was introduced to Walter Sisulu, an activist for the African National Congress, the ANC. Sisulu secured Mandela a job as an articled clerk at the law firm Witkin, Sidelsky, and Edelman. By night, he would work on his BA through the University of South Africa correspondence course. His guardian, Junjin Taba, would visit him and Justice, having forgiven both for running away. Upon returning to Thembuland, the regent died in the winter of 1942. Mandela and Justice traveled to Thembuland to attend the funeral, but unfortunately, they arrived a day late. Nelson Mandela completed and passed his BA exam in 1943. After that, he returned to Johannesburg to follow a political path as a lawyer. After joining the ANC, Mandela marched in support of a successful bus boycott to reverse fare rises. He also began law studies at the University of Witwatersrand, where despite facing racism for being the only native African in the faculty, he befriended several liberal and communist European, Jewish, and Indian students, among them Joe Slovo, Harry Schwartz, and Ruth First. In Easter Sunday, 1944, Nelson Mandela was one of the founders of the African National Congress Youth League, with Anton Lembede as president and Mandela himself as a member of the executive committee. On a personal level, Nelson Mandela was a happy man during this time, getting married to a nurse and ANC activist, Evelyn Masi, in October 5, 1944. The couple's first child, Madiba Thembi Thembekele, was born in 1946, and their second, a daughter named Makaziwe, was born in 1947, dying just 9 months later from meningitis. During the South African general election in 1948, where only whites were permitted to vote, Daniel Francois Malan took power after having united the Afrikaner Party to form the National Party. The party codified and expanded racial segregation with the new apartheid legislation.
The African people are realizing that apartheid means nothing else but oppression and exploitation to them. If Mr. Prinslow's contention is correct, then why do we have the unrest in the countryside, in the most backward areas of the country? If Mr. Prinslow's information is also correct, then why do we have the deposition of chiefs? Why do we have the government agents moving around in the rural areas to find out what is going on? If the people were so contented, surely it wouldn't be necessary to have so many agents watching over them.
Gaining influence in the ANC, Mandela appealed for direct action such as boycotts and strikes, in the hope of guiding the ANC to a more radical and revolutionary path. Due to devoting his time to politics, Nelson Mandela failed his final year at Witwatersrand 3 times before the university denied him his degree in 1949. In March 1950, Mandela became part of the ANC National Executive. That month, the Defend Free Speech Convention was held in Johannesburg, bringing together African, Indian, and communist activists to call an anti-apartheid general strike. Mandela was against the strike, but a majority of black workers took part, resulting in police repression and the introduction of the Suppression of Communism Act 1950. In that year, Nelson Mandela was elected national president of the ANC Youth League. Nelson Mandela was very politically active in the next 2 years, having campaigned against apartheid with the Defiance Campaign, and in July 1952, alongside 20 others, Mandela was arrested under the Suppression of Communism Act and stood trial in Johannesburg. Found guilty of statutory communism, they were given sentences of 9 months hard labor suspended for 2 years under the condition they would not participate in defiance actions. In September 1953, following a ban that prevented Mandela from speaking in public, Andrew Kunene read out Mandela's No Easy Walk to Freedom speech. There is no easy walk to freedom anywhere, and many of us will have to pass through the valley of the shadow again and again before we reach the mountaintops of our desires. Dangers and difficulties have not deterred us in the past. They will not frighten us now. But we must be prepared for them like men in business who do not waste energy in vain talk and idle action. The way of preparation lies in our rooting out all impurity and indiscipline from our organization and making it the bright and shining instrument that will cleave its way to freedom. In May 1954, after accusations of adultery, Mandela's marriage was at breaking point. Mandela and his associates started to imagine a South Africa post-apartheid, and they worked on the Freedom Charter, calling for the creation of a democratic, non-racialist state with the nationalization of major industry. The charter was adopted in June 1955 during a conference from Kliptown with more than 3,000 attendees. The event was ended by police intervention. Mandela was given a second public speaking ban in September 1955 and another in March 1956. After years of neglect from her husband, Evelyn initiated divorce proceedings. And in 1958, the marriage between Nelson Mandela and Evelyn Masi was over. Mandela's pursuit of justice and equality had driven him away from his family. In June 1958, Nelson Mandela had remarried with a social worker, Winnie Madikizela. Only a few months after his marriage, the treason trial began. Nelson Mandela, alongside most of the ANC executive, were accused of high treason against the state for advocating violent revolution. The defendants denied the charges. The trial lasted for 4 years, and on March 29, 1961, the judges found the defendants not guilty, a sentence that embarrassed the apartheid government. Mandela knew he had no time to lose.
The day the trial came to an end, the leaders of the African National Congress came home. They came to celebrate the results of the trial and the fact that they had been acquitted. My husband did not even enter the house. They were all jubilant and they were standing outside. I still remember very vividly Joe Modise, who is now heading the military wing of the ANC, walked into the house and asked me to pack a few items for my husband. I did, and I gave him the suitcase. And all I was told was that I'll be seeing him in a few days' time. I never really knew much about his political activities because I think they felt it was better that way. He left with the rest of the leadership that day. That was the last time I saw my husband at home.
Protests broke in the whole of South Africa. The people spoke out.
The Africans
want the franchise on the basis of one man, one vote. They want political independence. We have a large number of Africans who are educated and who are taking part in the political struggles of the African people. The question of education has nothing to do with the question of the vote. On numerous occasions, it has been proved in history that people can enjoy the vote even if they have no education. Of course, we desire education, and we think it's a good thing. But you don't have to have education in order to know that you want certain fundamental rights, you have got aspirations, you have got claims. It has nothing to do with education whatsoever. There are many people who feel that the reaction of the government to our stay at home, ordering a general mobilization, arming the white community, arresting 10,000s of Africans, the show of force throughout the country, notwithstanding our clear declaration that this campaign is being run on peaceful and non-violent lines, close the chapter as far as our methods of political struggle are concerned. There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider, in the light of our experiences in this stay at home, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
Mandela began to believe that armed struggle was the only way to achieve change, and subsequently co-founded Mkhoto Wesizwe, also known as the MK. It had no official ties to the ANC, and it was presided by Walter Sisulu. The military group MK announced their existence with 57 bombings in December 1961, followed by further attacks on New Year's Eve. On August 5, 1962, Nelson Mandela and Cecil Williams were captured by the police near Howick. Sent to Johannesburg's Marshall Square prison, he was charged with inciting workers to strike and leaving the country without permission. He declined representation and used the trial to showcase ANC's moral opposition to racism. He was then moved to Pretoria and began his correspondence studies for a Bachelor of Laws from the University of London. His hearing commenced on the 15th of October, 1962. Mandela, instead of pleading his innocence, used this moment as a platform for a political speech. He was considered guilty and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. In the summer of 1963, the police raided Lillisley Farm, where they found paperwork documenting the MK's activities, some of which mentioned Mandela. In October 1963, Mandela joined 9 others on trial for sabotage that would become known as the Rivonia Trial. Initially, the chief prosecutor was after the death penalty. During the trial on the 20th of April 1964, facing execution, Nelson Mandela addressed the court.
I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the idea of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an idea for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
In June 1964, after admitting to sabotage, Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Ahmed Kathrada, Govan Mbeki, Raymond Mulaba, Dennis Goldberg, Elias Motsoaledi, and Andrew Mlangeni were considered guilty. The very next day, they were sentenced to life in prison and sent to Robben Island. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, a son of the Madiba clan, was now jailed for life and was simply known as prisoner number 46664.
My little daughter Zinzi was about 6 years. She was playing outside, and then she came into the house and said, "Mommy, you say Daddy is in prison because he is fighting for the black people." I said, "Yes, darling." And then she said, "But now you say all the black men fight for the black people so that they should have all the things the whites have in this country, isn't it?" I answered her. I said, "Yes." And then she said, "But next door, Mommy, their father is there at home. Why is my father in jail and not the father next door?" In our Sikh society, when a man hasn't been to prison, you look twice at that black man. How is it possible that in racist South Africa he hasn't been to prison?
With Robben Island as his new home, Mandela heard the sad news of the death of his mother in 1968 and of his eldest son, Thembi, in 1969. He was not allowed to go to any of their funerals. From 1964 to 1982, Mandela would suffer verbal and physical abuse from the white prison wardens. He spent his days breaking rocks into gravel or working in a lime quarry on the island. Despite his miserable living conditions, Mandela found the sanity and the clarity to work on his law degree at night and engaged in work and hunger strikes to improve prison conditions. Even in the most extreme moment of his life, he found the strength to fight. Renewed international interest in his struggle came by July 1978, when Mandela celebrated his 60th birthday. Still in prison, he was awarded the Freedom of the City of Glasgow in 1980. In March of that same year, the slogan "Free Mandela" was created by journalist Percy Quoboza, speaking during an international campaign that led the UN Security Council to call for his release. Despite the growing foreign pressure, U.S. President Ronald Reagan and UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher considered Mandela a communist terrorist and supported the South African government in their refusal for release. In April 1982, Mandela was transferred to Pollsmoor Prison along with Walter Sisulu, Andrew Mlangeni, Ahmed Kathrada, and Raymond Mlaba. During that time, South Africa's President P.W. Botha permitted colored and Indian citizens to vote for their own parliaments, but black Africans were excluded, in an attempt to divide the anti-apartheid movement. Violence broke out across the country and escalated, with many fearing civil war. Several banks and corporations stopped investing in South Africa. Margaret Thatcher, previously supportive of Botha's position, was now pleading for Mandela's release in an attempt to stop the violence and to restore calm and order. P.W. Botha, however, declined.
Our leaders called on President Botha to remove violence, to free all those who have been imprisoned, and to allow the return of all those who have been driven into exile, to unban the People's Organization, the African National Congress, to dismantle apartheid, to allow free political activity so that the people may decide who will govern. We call upon the world to accept these demands.
In February 1985, President Botha offered Mandela a conditional release. Nelson Mandela refused. Due to an escalation in violence, Botha declared a state of emergency in June and initiated a police repression on unrest. Mandela attempted to talk to Botha during this period, but the president denied him. In 1988, 4 government figures initiated negotiations with Mandela for his conditional release. Mandela rejected all conditions and insisted that the ANC would only end the armed struggle when the government renounced violence. Mandela's birthday celebrations that year were marked by a tribute concert at Wembley Stadium in London, organized by the BBC. Several musicians and celebrities appealed for Mandela's release. Recovering from tuberculosis caused by dank conditions in his cell, Mandela was moved to Victor Verster's prison near Paarl in December 1988. Housed in a comfortable warden's house, Mandela completed his law degree. In 1989, P.W. Botha suffered a stroke. Although he retained state presidency, he stepped down as president of the National Party. F.W. de Klerk stepped in as his replacement. De Klerk was appointed president of South Africa in 1989. In November of that year, the Berlin Wall fell, and de Klerk thought it was the opportune moment to initiate negotiations with Mandela for his release. De Klerk released all ANC political prisoners except Mandela. On February 2, 1990, F.W. de Klerk announced to the world the release of political prisoner number 46664, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela.
Our country and all its people have been embroiled in conflict, tension, and violent struggle for decades. It is time for us to break out of the cycle of violence and to break through to peace and reconciliation. The silent majority is yearning for this. The youth deserve it. With the steps the government has taken, it has proven its good faith, and the table is laid for sensible leaders to begin talking about a new dispensation. In this connection, Mr. Nelson Mandela could play an important part. The government has noted that he has declared himself to be willing to make a constructive contribution to the peaceful political process in South Africa. I wish to put it plainly that the government has taken a firm decision to release Mr. Mandela unconditionally. I am serious about bringing this matter to finality without delay. The government will take a decision soon on the date of his release.
On February 11th, he walked out of Victor Verster prison gates. Billions watched as it was broadcasted on live TV.
Walking strongly, step by step, further into freedom. The ANC flags, And one wonders what must be passing through Mr. Mandela's mind at this moment. The day he has also been waiting for. Excitement, people breaking through the barriers, the human barriers of the marshals who intended to keep Mr. Mandela free so that everybody could see him. An excited crowd. They've been standing in the sun the whole day, waiting for this moment. And the crowd getting excited. There's Mr. Mandela, Mr. Nelson Mandela, a free man taking his first steps into a new South Africa. Mrs. Winnie Mandela next to him, waving to the crowds. Hand in hand, they leave the Victor Verster prison. Officials, marshals of the National Reception Committee trying to get the people, and a salute from Mr. Nelson Mandela, his wife Winnie, greeting the people outside the fences of the Victor Verster prison. That is the man who the world has been waiting to see. His first public appearance in nearly 3 decades.
Mr. Mandela, Mrs. Thatcher has invited you to go to London at some stage. What do you hope you might achieve by a visit to Britain at this time?
Well, an invitation from the British Prime Minister is something very important, which must be treated very seriously. To have the support of the British Prime Minister, the British government and the British people would give further momentum to the struggle in the country for change and for the dismantling of the party.
But is it going to be a long process?
Well, I hope not, because we have made it easy for him that an agreement is issued to reach as soon as possible. As far as we are concerned, we are fully prepared to cooperate in easing problems with him once we are convinced that he wants to write a new chapter in the history of the country.
And what is the immediate demands that you're making on the government, which they haven't actually done yet, like lifting the state of emergency?
Yes, quite, releasing political prisoners, allowing exiles to return, withdrawing the army from the locations, and generally creating conditions for free political activity in the country. Those are the demands.
The outside world is a fairly violent place these days, though. How much have you been able to keep in touch with what has been happening over the last 27 years?
In a general way, of course, at first it was very difficult because we didn't get newspapers. We had no access to the radio and to television. But once we had access to all these means of sources of information, we were able, to follow events inside and outside the country.
One final question, Mr. Mandela. After 27 years being locked up, do you feel that your life has been wasted?
Yes and no. To spend 27 years in prison, you see, you lose a lot. But at the same time, although prison is not the place for any human being, one was able to reflect, to think, and that this has been rewarding.
I don't think one can actually describe that. One of those things that you had to be there.
It was a hot day, and I was out and about and waiting for that cavalcade to come through. By the time it came through, I was exhausted. There was also a mini riot going on at the back of the Grand Parade at the same time, and you had that tension that you didn't know whether this incredible event would at any point go wrong, and that this man who had spent so many years in prison was actually going to be assassinated. We all had that in the back of our minds.
Up until then, Madiba was a slogan on a t-shirt, slogan on a poster, and then saw the person, the actual person. I don't remember seeing him as an old failed person. I just saw Madiba, so that was Madiba.
You could sort of visibly see how Nelson Mandela, onto the balcony, was almost sort of closing the door on the past and opening the door to the future.
After his release, Mandela initiated a tour of Africa, meeting supporters and politicians. In London, he appeared at the Nelson Mandela, an international tribute for a Free South Africa concert at Wembley Stadium. In France, he was greeted by Francois Mitterrand, and in the Vatican by John Paul II. In Cuba, he met his hero and friend Fidel Castro. Nelson Mandela was then elected ANC president in 1991, replacing his friend Oliver Tambo. But once again, while his political life grew stronger, his personal one was shattered. Winnie Mandela had been charged and found guilty of kidnapping and assault and sentenced to 6 years in prison in June 1991. And on April 13, 1992, Mandela announced their separation. In July 1993, F.W. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela were both awarded the Liberty Medal by President Bill Clinton and jointly received the Nobel Peace Prize in Norway. And with the general election set for 27 April 1994, the ANC began campaigning.
As the election date draws closer, so the campaigning becomes ever more intense. Nelson Mandela electioneering in the key province of Natal, and he chose a township just outside Durban to tell the crowds it would be here where he would cast his vote.
I am going to be here in Natal. I want to vote here to come and vote here.
His schedule is one that campaign staff are finding hard to keep up with, but it's also a sign of Mr. Mandela's eagerness for the political fray and his stamina. He'll be 76 years old next birthday. It also indicates the importance of this region to the ANC's election campaign. This township has been the scene of recent fierce fighting between Zulus who support the ANC and those who back Inkatha. Now it is an ANC stronghold, and at a local stadium they flock to Mr. Mandela's banner in their tens of thousands. This is the second time in a fortnight that Mr. Mandela has visited Natal. That and his decision to cast his vote here is a measure of the political importance that both he and his campaign staff now place on the area. Before a predominantly Zulu audience, Mr. Mandela pledged his support for the Zulu King's call for an end to the violence. King Zwelithini is a key figure for most Zulus, and all the main leaders know the value of courting him.
It was a strong call to all of us. I was very happy His Majesty came out openly against violence, because he is not just my leader, he is my king.
But despite the support the ANC has here, this is also a region under a state of emergency. And although many do want to vote, others remain bitterly opposed to elections here. With that in mind, 900 more troops are moving in to reinforce the 3,000 already on the ground.
Stanley Greenberg orchestrated the foundation of people's forums across South Africa. Forums in which Mandela could appear.
In prison, there have been men, who are very good in the sense that they understand our point of view, and they do everything to try and make you as happy as possible. And that has wiped out any bitterness which a man could have.
After 27 years of political imprisonment and a lifetime dedicated to the freedom of South Africa, on May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela would be inaugurated as the first democratically elected native African president of the Republic of South Africa.
Your Majesties, Your Royal Highnesses, distinguished guests, comrades and friends, today all us do, by our presence here and by our celebrations in other parts of our country and the world, confer glory and hope to newborn liberty. Out of the experience of an extraordinary human disaster that lasted too long, must be born a society of which all humanity will be proud.
Mandela saw the national unity of South Africa as his first task, and in 1995, he had a great opportunity to embark on his mission. When South Africa won an epic final against the favorites New Zealand in the 1995 Rugby World Cup, Nelson Mandela handed the trophy to the captain of the Springboks, Francois Pienaar, wearing the shirt of South Africa's rugby team with Pienaar's number 6 on his back. Since rugby was seen as a sport for whites and hated by the black South Africans, this gesture was of great importance and opened the minds of millions of South Africans to embrace a multiracial society.
We were in a state of wonderment. Now, it lasted very little. I mean, the state of wonderment meant that we were like going to school and there's a headmaster sitting there, a nice headmaster, beneficent headmaster. He came and shook hands with you. You felt somehow that there was gold dust in your hand. I tell you that. I mean, I'm not being naive or simple. You have gold dust in your hand. But then you realize that Mr. Mandela didn't want you to feel that you had gold dust in your hand.
Nelson Mandela had fulfilled his dream.
How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Why do you look younger every time I see you? Well, John, how are you?
Didn't change either.
Very nice to see you. I'm happy to see you.
There is no doubt that the quality of the people concerned has changed. The quality of ministers, deputy ministers, has changed from Mr. Mandela's first government. I mean, Mr. Mandela's first government was remarkable in terms of racial composition, gender, was really remarkable, high quality.
We fight against two features which are the hallmarks of African life in South Africa and which are entrenched by legislation which we seek to have repealed. These features are poverty and lack of human dignity. And we do not need communists or so-called agitators to teach us about these things. South Africa is the richest country in Africa and could be one of the richest countries in the world. But it is a land of extremes and remarkable contrasts. The whites enjoy
what may well be the highest standard of living in the world, whilst Africans live in poverty and misery. In this new century, millions of people in the world's poorest countries remain imprisoned, enslaved, and in chains. They are trapped in the prison of poverty. It is time to set them free.
It looks like there is a deficit when it comes to the supply of heroes, and Madiba has been conveniently looked upon as someone who could fill that gap, and that is why we have made him into a saint.
As promised, Nelson Mandela did not run for a second term in office. And in 1999, he gave his farewell speech and then retired. By that point, Mandela had remarried, this time with Graça Machel, widow of Mozambique's former president Samora Machel. Mandela, a symbol of freedom and hope to millions of people worldwide, would spend his days working with the Nelson Mandela Foundation, founded in 1995, fighting HIV and AIDS in the country. In 2003, Mandela criticized UK Prime Minister Tony Blair and US President George W. Bush for the war in Iraq. In June 2004, Mandela announced he was retiring from public life.
Friends, I am privileged to be here today at the invitation of the campaign to make poverty history. As you know, I recently formally announced my retirement from public life.
We want him back, you know. Although he's an old man, but he's an icon to us, a hero to us. We will still want his diplomacy.
Let us recommit ourselves to building a better future for all South Africans, black and white. Let us pursue the ideal for which Madiba has fought his entire life.
I think he's been an important figure in history. He's done extraordinary things, not just for his own country. I think he's been a sort of touchstone for others. You see messages from the entire world, for a man who's perhaps different to all others.
Nelson Mandela stood up for a fair country, and the world respects the man that became an ideal. He's a beacon for kindness and fairness, but also an example of human struggle and what one man can achieve. His people love him. The world respects him. South Africa changed with Mandela. However, there was still work to be done.
Mandela is a peaceful man. That's exactly what Mandela wants. Mandela wants us to work together. Tata wants us all to be together. But there's no changes yet. It's still like that. So really, it will be a miracle if it changes.
Economically, we are still lagging behind because the purse strings are still the main purse strings are still being controlled by our white counterparts.
the white people wants to interact with black people. Black people don't want to really interact with white people. And that gives you a negative at work as well. Because white people want to work with the black people don't want to work with the white people because they think previously disadvantaged, they want more.
Locals call this railway line the border.
Blacks on that side, coloureds this side, whites more in the upper class area.
That side is for the coloureds only.
The coloured side of the tracks is renowned for its drug gangs and overcrowding, but it's better than living in the black slums on the other side.
It's still apartheid time, this time, because the coloureds are still staying comfortable because they do have better jobs than us.
It was the apartheid government which dumped black people here. Segregation was supposed to end with the election of South Africa's first black president 15 years ago. But few here think that's likely to happen.
We'll never be combined.
We'll never be integrated with white people at all. It's only in the workplace that black people will mix with white people in the future. Only in the workplace.
Only a business.
For others, though, mixing at work is just the first steps to wider integration. Wealth will filter down the railway line in the end.
People cluster by classes, their income decides where they can live, and it's only as more and more blacks, coloureds and Indians move into the middle class and the business class that you'll get more rainbow effects.
For these kids, making that move up the tracks will be difficult. Until they do, much of what their city and country have to offer will remain out of reach.
In 2010, South Africa celebrated the 20th anniversary of the release of Nelson Mandela. But more than the celebration of the release of one man, it was also the release of an entire country. Nelson Mandela broke the apartheid chains, and although South Africa remains a divided country, the conditions in which all people live has vastly improved. Mandela is a hero of the world. And in June 2013, the world would once again tune in to watch Mandela's last battle.
Former President Mandela remains in a critical condition in hospital. The doctors are doing everything possible to ensure his well-being and comfort. I was with the Deputy President, Cyril Ramaphosa. Given the hour that we go to the hospital, of course it was late. He was already asleep, and we were there, looked at him, saw him, and we then had a bit of a discussion with the doctors, as well as his wife, Graça Machel, and we left. I don't think I can be in a position to give further details. I'm not a doctor.
Mandela is now fighting the battle for his own life. and his country, for which he spent an entire life fighting for, has come together to help and give strength to their icon and liberator. The world's media has descended on South Africa once more to report the news of his condition. Even during a time when his condition is critical, journalists are reporting that he is improving. Nelson Mandela is still fighting.
Well, joining us now outside Mr. Mandela's hospital is the leading South African journalist, Deborah Patta. These conflicting signals you have, on the one hand, Mr. Zuma saying, you know, he could be, I hope he can go home, and you have President de Klerk, former President de Klerk, flying back from Europe, cutting short his trip.
Well, it's very difficult to know what to make of it. It's terribly confusing. Critical but stable is the official word. It's kind of become a national obsession, sifting through all this information for frank and honest statements.
Global, I can assure you.
Yes, and in some ways it's very Mandela-esque, as he, if there is such a word, as he clings to life, as he lingers. Perhaps that helps the South African nation come to terms with saying goodbye, because after all, this is the nation built from the ruins of apartheid, and behind the bickering over who he belongs to and what his condition is another story, and that story is really about a nation and an extraordinary love between Nelson Mandela and his people.
1, 2, 3. He's got the whole world in his hands. 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 He's got the wind and the rain in his hands. He's got the wind and the rain in his hands. He's got the wind and the rain in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands.
Nobody who has got some conscience politically would have avoided doing exactly the same things that we did.
When my grandfather would ask me when I completed my matric what you wanted to be, I immediately say I want to be a DJ. He says, what's a DJ? I say a disc jockey. Nonsense. No Mandela will ever become such. You need to go out and find a career. So my grandfather has really been the driver behind the person that I needed to be. He then pulled me out about 2002. You need to go back home. I want you to study further. And I thought that was bizarre because I had studied what I thought I had an interest on, which is marketing and business management. I had 2 businesses of my own, and I thought this was the path I was following. But my grandfather had other plans and other thoughts. Upon my graduation, my grandfather said, so, are you still that eager businessman you wanted to be? And with his sense of humor, you know, he had seen that I had changed and I had become more community driven. And that's the lesson learned for my grandfather, that Mandelas are supposed to ensure that they are of service to our people.
Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela has built a legacy of kindness and human strength. A legacy that will not be forgotten. Because if the war against poverty, inequalities, and segregation is still being fought, a major battle was surely won. And Nelson Mandela was the general behind that victory.